Ladies and gentlemen, friends of freedom and democracy for the people of Syria. As we begin today, I'd like to come to order and as a reminder, if there are any disruption of the proceedings, it will result in an immediate removal and potential arrest, but we would proceed immediately too. I want to thank you for being here today as we address a matter of grave concern and moral urgency. For more than 10 years, the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad, backed by war criminal Vladimir Putin, has perpetrated unspeakable atrocities against the people of Syria. Following peaceful demands for democracy and a stop to the brutal corruption of the narco-trafficking Assad crime family, protesters were met with unimaginable atrocities that continue today. Over half of the population of Syria, with more than 14 million people, have been forced to flee their homes, schools, farms, religious institutions, and businesses. The United Nations sadly has stopped counting the number of those murdered at the hands of the regime at 500,000. We know, sadly, approximately 1 million people, including women and children, have been murdered by the Assad regime. The ability of Bashar al-Assad to brutally quash opposition was due to immediate and ongoing support for the Assad regime from war criminal Putin. Bashar al-Assad has given war criminal Putin free rein in the country of Syria. The same tactics and atrocities we witnessed on Monday, the bombing of a children's hospital in Kyiv that we saw, residential buildings, all began, sadly, in Syria with the murderous leveling of Aleppo, then the murderous leveling of the city of Mariupol in Ukraine. And now we see that Kharkiv is under attack with 1.3 million people with the same tactic of total destruction, which is gruesomely reminiscent of what Hitler was trying to do to London. And now, in Kyiv, as we saw with the country's largest children's hospital bomb, the images of bloodied Ukrainian children who've just had surgery or received chemotherapy infusion outside of the bombed hospital sadly evoke images of Syrian children being buried in rubble caused by the Assad and Putin bombs. Brutal tactics, chemical weapons, attacks on children, the indiscriminate bombings, and the systematic targeting of civilians constitute war crimes that cannot go unanswered. Sadly, the complete lack of response and accountability for the crimes against humanity in Syria have laid the groundwork for the invasion of Ukraine. The scale of suffering inflicted upon innocent men, women, and children is a stain on humanity itself. Particularly heinous are the double-tap strikes, where the first responders are bombed as they're responding to the initial strike. The involvement of Moscow in Syria is not an isolated incident. It is part of a broader pattern of aggression and impunity that Putin has promoted because he knows the unfounded fears of escalation will ensure his atrocities continue. Just this morning, Assad and war criminal Putin bombarded the countryside and villages around Aleppo and Idlib with missiles and bombs. How many more Syrians and Ukrainians have to die before the world takes action? There is a direct link between what Russia has done in Syria and its actions in Ukraine. In both instances, we see disrespect for sovereignty, human rights, and the rule of law. We're in a conflict we did not choose worldwide of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. Justice and accountability are not abstract ideals. They are the foundations upon which a just and peaceful world is built. We must ensure that those responsible for these heinous acts are brought to justice, that the victims are remembered, and that the international community stands united in condemning such barbarity. Those who attempt to normalize unrepentant mass murderer Bashar al-Assad are doing business with death itself. Forcible repatriation of Syrians under this maniacal regime is murder. As soon as they set foot in Syria, they are rounded up by the regime, henchmen, and never seen again. There can be no peace for Syrians in the region while Assad remains in power. Let us honor the memory of those who have suffered and perished by committing ourselves to the cause of justice, human rights, enduring quest for peace. Today we'll hear from an extraordinary, outstanding panel of witnesses. First, we will hear from M. Night Shyamalan, who is so appreciated worldwide. He is best known for his outstanding career as a film director, screenwriter, and producer, but is here today in the capacity as the co-founder and president of the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation. We will then hear from Mohammed Ghanem Ranam, a Syrian civil society leader and human rights activist. And finally, we will hear from Muaz Mustafa, the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, who came by Chinook helicopter to get here, I believe, who has just returned from U.S. forces from delivering critical aid to the Raqqa refugee camp in southeast Syria, where humanitarian and medical aid have been blocked for more than a year due to war criminal Putin and the dictator Assad. I'm grateful that the House overwhelmingly passed bipartisan legislation, Democrats and Republicans, House Resolution 3203, the Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act, and I urge the Senate to pass this bill and save lives. Thank you for your time here today, and now I yield to the Ranking Member, Steve Cohen, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. The Syrian people have been plagued by civil war now for 13 years. Violence and starvation and murders has gone on and on. It's a humanitarian crisis that continues to exact a devastating toll on innocent civilians. The Assad regime, with its blatant disregard for human life and dignity, has perpetrated unspeakable acts of violence against its own people. From the onset of this conflict, we've witnessed scenes of indiscriminate bombings, chemical weapon attacks, and torture. Syrian people have endured unimaginable suffering, forced to live in constant fear and uncertainty as their homes, schools, and hospitals have been destroyed. The responsibility of these crimes lies squarely with the Assad regime, and that's the reason they're having a civil war, because the Assad regime has been bad for a long time, and people know it. A regime that shows no remorse for its actions, no willingness to negotiate peace, and no respect for international law. And he's not acting alone. He's got allies that are just as villainous as he, including Putin, who provides military support and diplomatic cover for Assad's atrocities. Putin's unwavering support for Assad has not only prolonged the conflict, but escalated the violence. And what Mr. Wilson said, what Putin has been doing in Ukraine and Mariupol, and what he did in Aleppo, is part of his tactics. And then Hitler did the same thing in Warsaw to try to level a city and destroy the populace, and have no concern about civilian populations. But Putin's helping Assad, and it's only prolonged the conflict. Russian airstrikes have targeted civilian infrastructure, as he's done in Ukraine, and has done another fighting terrorism under that guise, but it's led to deterioration and killing innocent lives. Moscow's vetoes in the United Nations Security Council have thwarted efforts to hold the Assad regime accountable and deliver humanitarian aid to those in desperate need. Assad and Russia's collaboration is a stark reminder of the lengths of authoritarian regimes will go to maintain their grip on power. Quite a few authoritarian regimes around, but Putin is the worst. Xi in China, authoritarian regime. Assad and Hamas is an authoritarian regime. Another one. Assad has been torturing his people for too long. Should stop. We need to continue providing humanitarian aid for diplomatic and a military solution, hopefully, and ensure those responsible for war crimes face justice. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and how we can best support the Syrian people. And with that, I'd like to ask the chairman a question.
Yes.
My father was a psychiatrist. I learned a little bit from him. Do you think that when Mrs. Putin named her son War Criminal Putin, that might have been some foreshadowing? I yield back.
And ladies and gentlemen, again, you can tell that we work together, Democrats and Republicans, okay? and I have to take abuse from him sometimes. But no, hey, but very seriously, the ranking member and the format today, we have so many multiple hearings, markups going on, that we've got members of the House and bicameral members of the Senate who, based on how they can get away, will be bouncing back and forth. And the format is that each of you, we would like to have 5 minutes of presentation, and then we would have questions from the members as they come and go. And but we will begin indeed with Mr. Shyamalan, and we just appreciate so much.
Thank you. Go ahead. Okay. Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Cohen, esteemed staff members of the Helsinki Commission, I am grateful for the opportunity to appear before you today as a witness to the tragic consequences of Russia's intervention in Syria. My testimony is drawn from my first-hand experiences on the front lines of the Syrian conflict. Born and raised in Damascus, I lived in Syria for nearly 3 decades. My first direct encounter with the Assad regime occurred during my college years when I was unjustly detained and tried in a military court, despite being a civilian. Since 2011, I've been deeply involved in addressing the Syrian conflict, engaging in the process with 3 different U.S. administrations at the highest levels. Russia's military intervention in Syria has wrought devastating consequences. Russia has committed extensive war crimes, killing thousands of Syrian civilians and obliterating hospitals, schools, mosques, marketplaces and residential neighborhoods. Alongside my written testimony, I'm submitting 2 reports from credible Syrian human rights organizations that chronicle the mass slaughter of thousands of Syrian civilians by Russian forces in over 360 documented massacres. This intervention triggered the worst refugee crisis since World War II. Only after Russia's intervention in Syria did the refugee crisis reach unprecedented levels, with Russian forces getting involved and the Obama administration's refusal to provide effective support to the Syrian opposition or enact a no-fly zone to help civilians stay in their homes. Millions were forced to seek safety in Europe. Putin and Assad strategically weaponized these refugee flows to destabilize domestic European politics. It must also be noted that the unholy alliance between Iran and Russia, which is currently manifesting in Ukraine with Iran supplying lethal drones to Russia, has its roots in Syria. Russia's intervention in Syria was initiated, in fact, following a covert plea by Iranian General Qasem Soleimani to President Putin for help in preserving Assad's regime. Additionally, Russia's provision of crucial air cover to the IRGC, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups significantly enhanced their operations on the ground in Syria. This support comes as Russia's military intervention predominantly targeted moderate Syrian opposition groups that were actively fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Recent leaks have also revealed joint planning by Russia, Iran, and Assad to precipitate an American withdrawal from Syria by intensifying assaults on U.S. troops stationed in Syria. Russia has also sabotaged the political process, using its veto power at the UN Security Council as many as 18 times to politically shield Assad and block initiatives aimed at holding him accountable. Most egregiously, Russia used its veto to terminate the UN humanitarian cross-border aid mechanism in Syria, a crucial lifeline that sustained millions for 9 years. This move, which mirrors Moscow's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain agreement, not only exacerbates the humanitarian crisis, but also consolidates Assad's control by handing him the reins to distribute UN aid to the very population he persecutes, all while the US appears to tacitly consent. Yet, despite all this, Russia got away with it all, a lesson that Putin noted and replicated again in Ukraine. Policymakers who deemed confronting Russia in Syria too costly or misaligned with U.S. interests now have to contend with the far greater costs of dealing with the terrorism, deepening refugee crises, and then embolden Putin, who has not only invaded Ukraine, but also threatens further expansion into Europe. Amidst this turmoil, the Biden administration, much like its Republican and Democratic predecessors, clings to a failed notion that dialogue with Putin could somehow bring resolution to the Syrian conflict. Time and again, this approach has proven ineffectual, provoking further aggression instead of fostering peace. The continued reliance on this strategy, despite its chronic failures, represents a profound misjudgment, a tragic error that continues to exact a heavy toll on lives and regional stability. Chairman Wilson and Ranking Member Cohen, long before Russia's military intervention in Syria and its invasion of Ukraine, my staff and I had engaged with senior U.S. officials across various agencies, advocating for basic support to protect Syrian civilians. During trips to Syria, I was alarmed to see the dire lack of resources available to the moderate opposition. Upon returning, I conveyed my concerns to officials at the State Department and the National Security Council at the White House, warning that without support, extremists could hijack the Syrian revolution. Instead of providing meaningful military aid, the U.S. offered soon-to-expire MREs, meals ready to eat. Long before the annexation of Crimea, we approached senior U.S. officials emphasizing that failing to curb Putin's actions in Syria could have repercussions beyond Syria's borders, potentially threatening Europe as well. However, these warnings were dismissed. The Obama administration believed that the conflict could be contained within Syria's borders. At the time, the Obama administration was engaged in the so-called Russia reset policy, which viewed Putin as a pragmatic leader with whom deals could be made. Additionally, the administration was pursuing a nuclear deal with Iran, a key patron of Assad. Repeatedly, when we urged the Obama administration to adopt basic measures to protect civilians in Syria, officials would rhetorically ask if we wanted to trigger World War III. This narrative was debunked twice when the Trump administration conducted targeted airstrikes on Wagner mercenaries in Deir ez-Zor, and also military facilities of the Assad regime in response to chemical attacks. Those strikes, though limited, managed to establish limited deterrence without spiraling into a global conflict, proving that the previous administration's justification for its inaction were less fact and more fiction. In fact, even after Russia intervened militarily, former General Petraeus repeatedly informed us that there were still viable methods to implement a no-fly zone without engaging in direct conflict, such as through conducting targeted airstrikes against Assad's forces that were actively targeting civilians. Far from securing cooperation, however, this appeasement strategy only emboldened Putin, culminating in the bold and illegal annexation of Crimea. When President Putin observed that he could flout international norms without significant repercussions, he saw an opportunity to extend such tactics into Europe, where the stakes for Russia were even higher. I'm convinced that if Putin had been decisively challenged in Syria, neither the annexation of Crimea nor the invasion of Ukraine would have occurred. I applaud the US Congress for acting against Russian intervention in Ukraine. However, I contend that with less than 5% of the amount of money appropriated, we could have effectively countered Putin, Iran, and their influence in Syria, potentially averting Russia's and Putin's more destructive actions. This leads us to a fundamental flaw in US policy towards Russia: the bifurcation in our approach to Putin's aggression in Syria and Ukraine. It's imperative that US policy erases this imaginary line, challenging Putin uniformly across both theaters. While US policy has been resolute against Putin's aggression in Ukraine, it paradoxically allows him a free rein in Syria, an arena of immense strategic and propaganda value to him. A stark illustration of this is seen over the past couple of years, during which the Biden administration has greenlit the rehabilitation and normalization of Bashar al-Assad. It has also intervened to block a bipartisan Senate bill developed with input from the Syrian American community that seeks to counter Assad's rehabilitation, a principal policy objective of Putin. Additionally, the administration has conceded to Russia by endorsing the so-called, quote, early recovery projects in regions under Assad's control, a term both Assad and Russia use synonymously with reconstruction. This has long been a strategic objective of Russia and Assad, to have the West ultimately finance the reconstruction of the very same devastation that they themselves have wrought. To counter this, pushing Bashar al-Assad out of power is essential. By turning Syria over to Putin and Khamenei, Assad has been pivotal in upholding Iranian and Russian interests in Syria, acting as a linchpin for their strategies in the region. Additionally, the US should reconsider initiatives like Timber Sycamore, the program that was designed to arm carefully vetted elements of the Syrian opposition. This program was disastrously terminated during the Trump administration in a bid to signal to Putin that the administration wants to improve ties to Russia, as verbatim stated by US officials verbatim. The cessation of this program undermined the Southern Front, a key moderate opposition coalition, which had been effective in maintaining order and curbing the activities of Iranian militias in southern Syria. As a result, Hezbollah and other Iranian militias have had free rein to launch attacks from southwest Syria on neighboring countries. Furthermore, since Assad regained control of the south, he has turned it into a hub for flooding the region with Captagon drugs, exacerbating what Jordanian officials describe as a war on their northern borders. Congress, particularly the Senate, should also pass H.R. 3202, the bipartisan Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act, introduced by Chairman Wilson, with wide support. This legislation aims to prevent the rehabilitation of Bashar al-Assad, a top objective of both Russia and Iran. Congress should also pass S-4625, bipartisan legislation introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, that would provide for the designation of the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism. In conclusion, U.S. policy has made critical errors by accommodating Russian objectives in Syria, which conflict with U.S. interests and global peace, by treating Russia as a partner in Syria and disregarding its actions that destabilize the region and contravene U.S. interests. This approach has led to the rise of transnational terrorism, a massive refugee crisis, and emboldened Putin to expand his aggression by projecting U.S. weakness. It was precisely in Syria where Putin found the audacity to extend his aggression to Crimea and Ukraine. Confronting Putin must, therefore, encompass a unified strategy that addresses both Syria and Ukraine. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rana. We now proceed to Mr. M. Night Shyamalan.
Thank you for having me here. This is a wonderful opportunity. You know, I kind of represent a different aspect of all this. I guess I would represent the kind of the novice, the American, just the American, where I started and where I am now, that kind of the movement from that, you know, and how I perceive this. My wife and I, we have a foundation, the M. Night Shyamalan Foundation, and we support leaders domestically and around the world. Moaz Mustafa is one of those leaders. We currently represent 12 of them, and he's one of them. And so we're here in support of that. But it was an interesting journey that I took, just as a kind of a normal American hearing about this, even with the interest that I had to help everyone, or my wife's kind of intense interest to help the world. When she came back and said, "Hey, let's support this person in Syria," my initial reaction was, "No way are we doing that." And I was very negative on it, because I was like, oh, there's a civil war, and you know, and to be honest, I had a lot of probably prejudices underneath that, of my beliefs about the violence over there, and well, there's no way to fix that, and that's just the way they are, and that's how we feel about those subjects, and it just makes you feel like too tight, and you turn away from it. And what I didn't realize at that moment is I had been told a story, and I bought into the story, and it was working on me. And as I got to know everyone and started to talk to everyone, I asked the question, who's telling this story? And I ultimately learned that Assad was the one that was telling this story, and I bought into it. So, you know, I'm a filmmaker. I make movies, and you know what we do from the beginning, when I'm making movies to when I'm writing it to we're selling it. Our job is to take a storyline and pull it out and make you guys hear it, and then you guys get so invested in that story that you can't wait to see how it ends. So you are invested, and you come to the movie theater. So my job, and every other storyteller's job, is to make you really invested. Well, this is the opposite with the story that's being told to us. The storyteller here, Assad, is trying to de-invest us from this story, to have the exact reaction that I had, which was, that's a mess. I don't want to deal with that. There's no way to get involved. It's too messy, all of that stuff. You know, it makes me uncomfortable. And he's honestly playing on our prejudices about Muslims and Muslim countries, and it worked. And so I didn't put any effort in, and I didn't want to get involved, and and that's where we started. But as I got to know everyone, there's a very, very different story, and actually quite a beautiful one. And so I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit, in the hopes of like changing interest in what's happening here, rather than to feel hopelessness. You know, bringing back agency to each of us to advocate on behalf of these wonderful people. So the story that I learned was kind of an amazing one, that America kind of inspired all of this, that democracy and it's the joy of it, and the wonderful existence of it inspired the youth of Syria. And they went out and they protested amongst many other countries that were at that time, you know, fighting for and advocating for democracy. And so they went out, and the kids went out and they spray painted on the walls, you know, democracy and "You're next, doctor." And Assad took these individuals, these children, and killed them. And more people came up, and city after city started to raise up in peaceful protest, just the way we taught them. and to fight for this. And it went on like this, and it grew and grew and grew, and public opinion started to turn on Assad, and it was inevitably going to topple. And that's when he changed the story and started telling the story I referenced, which was, hey, these are Muslim radicals, and as soon as he says that, we're out. We're all out, right? The whole Western world's gone, right? And he knows it, and he said it, and rather than, hey, they want democracy, and I'm going to kill them all. And this is kind of the pattern that we'll see in the world, I think, over and over and over, right? This inflection moment, the storytelling change that keeps us away. And so, as you all know here, but I'll reference some of it, what happened from that point on was he started to kill all the opposition, and then Russia got involved for many of the reasons that we've already heard here. But they are supporting the ideologies of authoritarian and dictatorships, and that's important. You know, the last thing that Russia wants is a democracy in Syria. So he comes in right at that moment and supports, and Iran did the same thing and came in and supported. So Russia with their air force and Iran with their ground, and here we are. And they labeled it civil war. And that's a wonderful way for us to stay out of it because it's someone else's family's problems. But that's not what's happening here. And it's been, you know, for me, learning, I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to learn from Mustafa and many of the players in this crisis that have been involved. I got to spend, you know, intimate time with a man named Caesar. I think he spoke to all of you guys. And he was the photographer for Assad. And he would, if Assad, for whatever reason, wanted to photograph all of his victims. So he photographed the children and the women and the men, everyone that was tortured. And then Muaz and others got him out of Syria with all the photos. And so he came to our house, actually, and we got to spend time with him. And I saw the photos, and 50,000 children, women. This is not a civil war. There's nothing, that's not what's happening here. I keep thinking on the car ride here what the word is. Genocide is the wiping out of a people, but we might need to unfortunately have a term for when a dictator just wipes out his opposition, his own country, and just wipes it out because he's not, you know, as you referenced, the lengths they will go to hold on. There's no lengths. They'll go all the way to the end and burn the whole country down. And so I got to know Caesar, and what was really beautiful is they're just regular people. This is just a father, and he would cry and just tell me stories of the courage it took. Because on their side, there is no other group that's fighting the people for freedom. They are also being held. You know, if he didn't do what Assad said, his family would be killed. So that's just the playbook. And so that group is in fear as well. They're all in prison as well. So I got to meet the gravedigger, who was a person that would make the mass graves, and I think he spoke to you as well. And he was quite shattered. He and his brother came, and he had told me that he had buried 500,000 people. So you know, these were directly the individuals that were right there and seeing things that we can't even comprehend. And so as I learned about everything, I wanted to just help with telling the story again. That's what I do, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody was hearing it properly. And then I always ask, you know, what can we do, and what are the possibilities here, and you know, why is it in our best interest, America, to get involved emotionally, and then, you know, in other ways here. And you know, we feel, all of us feel that when others are inspired by our value system and spread it around the world, it's an extension of our family, and so in that way we need to be responsible and support them in the right ways. And so I do feel it's important, and I agree with everything that's been said, that this was a blueprint for Ukraine and the future. So it was tried, and he pushed, and he saw. And not only the weapons that he tested on him, the tactics that he used, the exact pilots, the exact planes are being used in Ukraine that were used in Syria. This is a part 2, you know, and it'll be a part 3 and a part 4. There is a balancing act here of how to get involved, but avoiding and looking away from the story will end up with we all can see what's going to happen. One day we are going to have to send our brothers and sisters over there to do something, and that's what we're trying to avoid. you know, I asked this question, and over the years now, having worked with these guys and talking to the people that are doing it on the ground, I sense an opportunity. This is just me, the uninformed American, listening to the people on the ground. But I do think there's a moment here. I don't think he's strong. I don't think he's strong. He can't. He's not gaining, and the people have a lot of power there right now, and they're gaining. What they need is our support. And so it can be a different kind of support than sending military troops there into a war. I was asking Moaz, and I was saying, you know, do you think that's enough? You know, the support of, you know, that, you know, keeping the sanctions against the countries and the anti-normalization and maybe an envoy to Syria, these kind of things, and helping them and training them, the Syrian Free Army, and helping with them, you know, giving them intel, all the things that we can do to support. Is that enough? And, you know, what we believe in, my wife and I, we believe in that, you know, any child that's in a tough situation, they just need one person to see them, one person to believe in them, and they can themselves come out of that situation. That's actually proven in psychological terms, and we believe that as an organization to another organization. If we just see him, you know, that Moaz who's out there fighting for 14 years, and I say that to him all the time, Assad has no chance against you. He doesn't, and then he's on the ground and he believes and he can do extraordinary things. I believe that is on a country-to-country level as well. That if we see them, we see the Syrian people, the children. My family has gone to Syria there under protection, and you know, just being seen that we're here talking about them is giving them strength and is demoralizing the other side. So I do believe in igniting the human spirit, and it can do extraordinary things. So thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shyamalan. And we've been joined by Congressman Michael Lawler of New York, and we now proceed to Moaz Mustafa.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members, for giving me this opportunity. And it's a real honor to be sharing the panel with these two amazing people. And I am so grateful for Dr. Bhavna Shyamalan and M. Night Shyamalan for what they've done for the Syrian people. His wife and daughters went to liberated northern Syria when so many people are afraid to go, and gave and empowered these people on the ground by just being there. And I want to start, before I start my testimony, I have just come back from the 55-kilometer deconfliction zone in the Syrian desert alongside the border with Jordan and Iraq. There is the U.S. Al-Tanf garrison, where the commander of Task Force Armadillo and the U.S. servicemen and women support and train the Syria Free Army that continues the fight against ISIS and protect civilians. And I have a letter here from the commander of the Syria Free Army I'd like to read to you. In the name of freedom, justice, liberty, and democracy, in the name of humanity, I begin my message. From here where the sun rises, from here a small area lost in the midst of a desert, a place you may not know where it lies on a map, I send all of you a greeting from the partners of your great military. I send you the best regards from your partner force and ally that have fought and continue to fight the powers of evil and darkness on behalf of the world, civilization, and the light. I send you this message with my utmost respect and admiration to the people of the United States of America and the armed forces of the United States. I send to you my deepest thanks and gratitude for all of the support that you have provided us. I send to you a small token in the hand of the man carrying my letter. It is a coin minted by ISIS, but more importantly, it is the only trace remaining from the empire of evil that your military alongside its partners have destroyed. It is our partnership and your limited presence in the 55-kilometer deconfliction zone that keeps the evil state from reestablishing itself and ensures the security of the world and protects democratic values everywhere. Lieutenant Colonel Salim al-Antari, leader of the Syria Free Army, a U.S. partner force, also referred to as SFA. And now I begin my testimony. Assad regime has displaced 14 million civilians, by many estimates has killed 1 million, and countless civilians, men, women, children, and elderly, remain in Assad's dungeons as we sit here right now, including American citizens and citizens of other nationalities. If it was not for Putin in Iran keeping the genocidal, narco-trafficking animal Assad in power, Syria would be an emerging democracy today. It was allowing it was allowing Russia to test over 400 types of weapons on civilians in occupying Syria that allowed them to invade Ukraine and perfect the killing of innocent babies. If we leave Assad in power by turning a blind eye to his atrocities and not support the free Syrian people, no refugees will ever voluntarily return. And that is Putin's dream, to increase refugees in Europe, allowing the rise of extreme right-wing parties in disillusionment of the European Union. If we leave Assad in power, if we don't support Ukraine and Syrians against Putin, he will not stop there. He will attack NATO allies and in his pursuit of an evil authoritarian empire. We must support Ukrainians and Syrians in their pursuit of freedom, democracy, and dignity, and in their fight against our shared adversaries. I just came back from the liberated areas of southern Syria, as I mentioned, where Putin and Assad and Iran are besieging and starving thousands of innocent civilians in Rukban camp. It is our inspirational servicemen and women that train and support our SFA partners to protect these civilians and keep ISIS defeated. It is U.S. military planes that have helped my small non-governmental NGO, nonprofit organization to provide medical and humanitarian aid. And it is to babies that have literally nothing, not a single doctor, not a single anything. If it wasn't for U.S. military flights, there wouldn't be a single book for kids that have been stuck out there for 9 years with no school. The service and sacrifice of our military at the Al-Tanf garrison truly fills me with American pride. ISIS will always have hope of reestablishing itself if Assad, alongside Putin's Russia and Iran, occupy Syria. ISIS will be completely defeated only when Assad goes. Refugees will return home voluntarily only when Assad goes. And the world will be a safer place, and democracy will take root in Syria when Assad goes. And Iran will be defeated in the region if Assad goes. We are not asking for deployment of a single U.S. soldier or any direct military intervention. We merely ask that you give the Syrians and the Ukrainians the minimum tools to defeat Assad, Putin, and Iran for us, so that we are not forced to go to war with them later. Assad, Russia, and Iran are unable and unwilling to defeat ISIS. We must continue to sanction Assad, Putin, and Khamenei and their war criminal gangs. We must continue to support our Syrian and Ukrainian allies. We must pass the Assad Anti-Normalization Act, and unfortunately, Senator Cardin is not here today, and I want to say, Chairman Cardin, you have been at every event that we've held in Congress alongside our partners, the Holocaust Memorial Museum. You have had an amazing history of supporting the Syrian people. Do not tarnish it by not allowing the markup and vote on the Anti-Normalization Act before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We must appoint an official envoy on the ambassadorial level from the United States of America to show the world that we are serious about a political transition in Syria in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And we must not allow nations, allies nor enemies alike, to normalize with the genocidal dictator. Long live the Syrian revolution, and Slava Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And indeed, hey, each of you is so inspiring. And my inspiration has come from the Syrian Lebanese community of my home community of South Carolina. We were blessed with people from the Lebanese Syrian communities in the early 1900s coming to South Carolina, and they immediately assimilated and have become business leaders and become very valued members of society. And so I know of the capabilities and talents of the people of Syria. And so with that, however we can be helpful, I'm very grateful that we have Congressman Cleaver from Missouri, who's here, has joined us. And so, and we'll be having others come and go. But indeed, now we're on the 5-minute rule. And so the staff is going to be very brutal, reminding me 5 minutes is up. But no, but very seriously, each of you, it's so sad. The first victims of the current situation with Putin were the Russian people themselves. I've been to Russia a number of times. I thought it was going to be a modern country, and I didn't realize that an authoritarian dictator would try to recreate the failed Soviet Union. But the failed Soviet Union can be very beneficial for oligarchs who benefit, and that just as the communist system was to the benefit of the elite, here we go again. And so, and then now to spread it, as we've seen, into by maintaining troops in Moldova, by invading Georgia, by invading Ukraine, by threatening Armenia, by threatening Estonia, by threatening Poland. It comes together that he's trying to create the failed Soviet empire, and so all democracies need to be working together. And just Mr. Shyamalan, the inspiration again of the Syrian American community, how important that is. And each of you bring a perspective too of something that is really concerning, and that is Syrian refugees. I visited refugee camps. I was really startled. I've been to a lot of refugee camps of refugees from war-torn countries, from natural disasters, but the refugee camps I've been to with Syrians are they so extraordinarily organized. Everything about it. They have little shops set up. I mean, you don't do that at a refugee camp, but they do. Sadly, they may perceive they could be there a while too. But in the meantime, it shows enterprising people, and it's inspiring. And so, with that beginning here, what's this? What is the consequence of refugees being returned?
So we actually know, I don't have to hypothesize about this, Chairman Wilson. We actually know that the small number of refugees who have been forced to return to Syria, for example, Lebanon has been forcibly, unfortunately, returning Syrian refugees to Syria, is particularly political prisoners in the Rumiyah prison, notorious Rumiyah prison in Lebanon. We know that they've been killed. We know that they've been tortured to death. And so that's just a fact that's staring us in the face. Syria is not safe for the return of refugees. It's just not. So long as Assad remains in power, Syria will never be safe for the return of refugees. However, Assad, Putin, have been using the refugee crisis as leverage against European countries. I was recently in Europe, and I observed how some European countries were contending with this issue. Some, out of frustration, are thinking that maybe we should talk to Assad. That would be misguided. That would backfire. Those people do not want to go back because they know they will be killed.
Mr. Shyamalan.
Sorry. You know, as we move around, as I go country to country and visit it for my my work, I see the unease of this burden that comes as they're seeing at each country, and we spoke a little bit about it of, hey, that's that country's burden, and we're taking it on, which then starts to shift everything into a different balance of place as we're seeing, and it's again the storytelling that that's a hopeless situation and a hopeless people, and look at them, they can't even take care of them, they fight each other, they're so violent. This is what I shamefully had in my heart and my thoughts before, years before, and having now seen those people, they're strangely beautiful and innocent in a way that I can't believe in the face of what's happening to them. The family, I mean, every single one that we have encountered and they've met in my family has gone and spent time with, they just have love in their heart. They're just incredibly beautiful people. So Assad is not winning on that front at all. Their love is really, really bright, and the best of us, the best of humanity. So and I'm sure anybody that's encountered them has felt that as well.
Chairman, it's simple. If anyone is returned from anywhere to Syria, there's a very, very high likelihood of them not just being killed, of being tortured to death. Even if you're a loyalist of the Assad regime, all it takes is you get stopped at a checkpoint and the guy doesn't like your name or where you were born, or maybe he fought with his or her spouse in the morning, and that's good enough to be disappeared forever, as the Caesar photos and the gravediggers have taught us.
And indeed, we'll proceed, but I have hope and faith in the people of the region. I'll tell you again, because of the Syrian Lebanese community that I've seen, but also I've been to Beirut, okay? And so I saw what has been the Paris of the Middle East. And so we know what it can be. We know, I have not been, obviously, to Damascus, but we know what can be achieved there. And so I'm just so hopeful for the region, and just in any way that we can positively address it. And remarkably enough, it's going to be bipartisan, beginning with the ranking member, Steve Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me ask you first, sir. You mentioned that Putin kind of had planned the idea of the immigration to Europe to disturb in Europe and cause. Has there been any? What's the proof of that?
So the proof of that, first and foremost, is that Russia in Syria has systematically and deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure in Syria so that people simply cannot stay in their homes and will have to leave. Speaking with a former rebel commander while I was preparing my testimony, the rebel commander shared with me, and of course this stuff I know, but it's different when you hear it from people who were there on the ground when it happened. During the span of 15 months, during the onslaught on Aleppo, 2015, end of 2016, Russia dropped tens of thousands of tons of munitions on residential areas in Syria, including including bunker buster bombs. Bunker buster bombs are designed to go after those who are taking shelter in underground shelters. So Putin didn't even want people in underground shelters to feel safe. So those people had no option but to leave. Now, after they left, Putin realized that there is a great potential for using these massive refugee flows to destabilize domestic European politics, especially with fueling the rise of the far right. So now, Putin has been telling European countries that if you would like those refugees to go back, you have to underwrite the reconstruction of Syria. You have to finance the destruction that Putin, Assad, and Iran have wrought. And they use that as leverage. So long as Europe will say no to footing this bill, those refugees, according to Assad, will not welcome them back.
How many people have left Syria?
Half the population has been displaced internally and externally, and so you have at least 7 million people seeking shelter in neighboring countries and in Europe.
Where are most of them?
Millions are in Turkey. Turkey has at least over 3 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon also has over 1 million Syrian refugees. Jordan has over 1 million Syrian refugees, and then there are also millions in Europe.
What's Turkey's role been in this?
So Turkey, early on, I can speak from my own direct experiences. I've engaged with the Turkish officials at the highest levels, including the president, the prime minister, and the foreign minister. Turkey early on got on board with the policy of there was talk at the time of establishing a no-fly zone in Syria. So Turkish officials at the level of the prime minister and the president came out and said that Turkey would be willing to assist with that. When Mr. Obama also talked about a red line to be enforced in the case of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and that red line was crossed, Turkey also came out at the highest levels and said they would be willing to be a part of this operation to hold Assad accountable. But then after a while, they realized, according to a very senior Turkish official I spoke with years ago, that, quote, they were left holding the baby. So now, unfortunately, Turkish officials, also at the highest levels, are seeking rapprochement with Assad and talking about normalizing ties with Assad, something that is profoundly disturbing to our community. But when we reach out to U.S. officials, to Turkish officials, they counter by saying that, well, the United States has abdicated its leadership role in Syria. We have a problem. We have terrorism on our southern border. We have millions of refugees. The opposition is campaigning on a platform of sending refugees back to Syria if they're voted into office. So we have no option but to do this. That's why it's imperative for the United States to play or to restore its leadership role in the Syrian conflict. It would stabilize Syria, stabilize Turkey, stabilize the whole region.
There's a fighting force that came and helped, I think, America in fighting ISIS, and Turkey's not too fond of them.
Yes.
they analogize them to the PKK.
Correct.
Right. What did they call them? The Y?
The YPG.
Y.
They call them YPG militias.
Yeah. Where are they settled right now?
So that's mostly in northeastern Syria. That's where the Syrian Democratic Forces, American partners, work with American forces to combat ISIS. They're stationed in northeastern Syria.
And they're still active.
And they're still very active, yes.
I know they were good allies of ours.
So they have fought alongside American troops to fight ISIS alongside the Syria Free Army. However, the YPG, the original militia that was transformed eventually into SDF, was called the YPG. That's the name they chose for themselves. And they do have links to, it's just well documented, they do have links to the PKK, and that's why it's been a very thorny issue between Turkey and the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Steve Cohen. We now proceed to Congressman Michael Lawler of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up kind of right where you left off. I don't think there's any question the lack of a response after the quote-unquote red line was crossed created the kind of situation we see, but also I think emboldened and empowered Putin to act with respect to Ukraine. Because I think the lack of a coordinated response by the free world after that red line was crossed, I think gave Putin maybe a false sense of security in one respect, but I think it opened the door for him to do what he's done in Ukraine. And so, you know, you said before that this was a blueprint for Ukraine, and I think that's right. What is it that you believe Putin learned from this situation in Syria, and how he applied that to Ukraine?
So after, would you like to?
You can both. You can both. Yeah.
Okay. So Putin first perfected the attacks, the deliberate, indiscriminate attacks against civilian population centers and hospitals, and schools, places of worship like churches and mosques. In Syria, they honed those tactics in Syria, including a very cruel tactic called double tap strikes, where they also target first responders that rush to the scene of an attack. This tactic, as we speak, is being replicated now in Ukraine. Unfortunately. So when Putin realized, and this is what my testimony was about, when Putin realized that he got away with it all without any serious repercussions, he was emboldened. He found the audacity to extend those tactics into Europe. That's when the illegal annexation of Crimea happened. And that's when we approached senior US officials and said, Putin's actions in Syria must be curbed, otherwise there would be further expansion into Europe. Sadly, those warnings were dismissed. The Obama administration at the time was pursuing something called the Russia reset policy, which viewed Putin as a pragmatic leader to that you can cut deals with. They were also pursuing the Iran nuclear deal with Iran, and that's a key patron with Assad. During one senior level meetings with Mr. Rob Malley, who was at the time Mr. Obama's Middle East czar, after I made a plea for modest measures to protect to aid the Syrian opposition, he made it very clear to me that even striking ISIS in areas where ISIS was clashing with the Syrian opposition was off the table because, quote, that would, and I'm just quoting, that would, quote, piss off Assad and the Iranians. So clearly that was the priority at the time. So when that projected, Congressman Lawler, that projected American weakness, and that emboldened Putin to take this aggression to Ukraine.
Therein lies the fundamental problem here. Okay, when you take a macro look at the world right now, you have a coordinated effort between Russia, China, and Iran. Okay, China, the biggest purchaser of Iranian petroleum, 90% of it. And since Joe Biden took office, over $100 billion increase in the sale of Iranian petroleum. That's what's funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other terrorist networks in the region. And so you look at what has been allowed to occur because of weakness with respect to American leadership, and these are the consequences of it. These are the real-life consequences of a failure to act against aggression, against tyranny, against dictators and despots. Vladimir Putin has committed numerous genocides, both in Syria, in Ukraine, and should be held accountable, period. The Iranian regime should be held accountable, period. President Xi should be held accountable, period. They snuff out the opposition within their own countries. They murder them, straight up, because they know if the people actually had a voice, they would be out. They would be done. And they would be held accountable. And so it is incumbent upon the United States, the President of the United States, and Congress to act, period. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lawler. And actually, all of us are affected. His family is impacted. His wife's family lives in Moldova, which is a target of war criminal Putin. And so over and over again, it's amazing how members of Congress actually, as you're going to be seeing, because we've got some leaders here with Emmanuel Cleaver coming up next, and then we also have Congressman Mark Vesey, who's joined us from Texas, and Congresswoman Victoria Sparks, who has joined us from Indiana by way of the Soviet Union. She was born in Ukraine. So we now proceed with Congressman Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can either of you speak to the earthquake? Well, I guess maybe there were two earthquakes in the northwest section. Let me explain why I'm interested in it. It would seem to me, we may not have the accurate reports on what happened. I think I saw one report that 6,000 people may have died. But my interest is who comes to their aid now, because those people are going to be responsive to, I think, whoever comes to their aid.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. And I was there right after that earthquake, days after that earthquake. Between Turkey and Syria, 100,000 people died. It was horrible disaster. No matter where it would have been fallen, it looked like there were literally nuclear bombs that were dropped on entire cities. But what's the most heartbreaking thing in all of this is also what Assad and Russia had done to those victims. Number one, the Assad regime didn't even declare it an emergency situation. Imagine a horrible hurricane like Katrina or a horrible earthquake, God forbid, happens in the U.S. We don't even declare it an emergency situation. And he did that in order to make sure aid doesn't get in. Number two, according to the United States, to the United Nations, Assad is pretty much the Secretary General of the UN. He gets the final call of what United Nations aid comes in or out. Although it's our money, it's taxpayer dollars that are paying for aid that goes to the UN to Syria. He blocked the border off, and it was so horrible that people started assuming that the roads didn't exist, that somehow the highways weren't there. They kept saying the borders are closed. Well, the borders were closed by decree of Bashar al-Assad and his supporter, Putin, who's on the Security Council. And so we went over there, and we took over 35 media outlets, including 60 Minutes, which did a really powerful story, and I recommend everyone watch that piece. And the reason I took all these media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, is to show that the roads weren't closed. They were perfectly paved. There were so many aid trucks just waiting there. The only things that were allowed in were the ambulances, bringing back Syrians that died on the Turkish side so that they may be buried back home. The Assad regime then said that it was the sanctions by the United States that somehow was preventing the aid to the people there, which is an utter lie. Even the aid that made it to Damascus didn't even make it to regime-held areas that suffered from the earthquake. But the suffering came mostly in Jindaris. The epicenter in the Syrian side was in northern Aleppo countryside. And I sat and listened to people under rubble, yearning, pleading. Imagine, sir, your daughter or your mother under rubble. You can hear her the first hour, you can hear her the first day, you hear her into the second night, and all you can do is try to lift rocks. But the bulldozers that would have saved her were 6 kilometers away. That's less than 5 miles away, but wouldn't be allowed in without Assad's green light. And after vindictively waiting for 9 days, did he say some of the aid may be allowed in. People died in that earthquake, sir, that didn't have to. And it was because Bashar al-Assad continues to have full reign and sovereignty in the United Nations.
Were they Druze?
Sir, in terms of the Druze community? No, in the north, it was everyone. Druze, Christians, Muslims, the whole, because a lot of people had run away from Assad's killing, 14 million displaced, 7 million outside, 7 million internally displaced, mostly in the area where the earthquake happened. But you mentioned the Druze, and we should mention them. Sheikh al-Hajari, the spiritual leader of the Druze, has spoken to Chairman Wilson, and I recommend, sir, I'm happy to follow up and have you talk to him. He not only represents the Druze community in Syria, but the Druze community all over. And the fact is, right now, the Assad regime cuts off electricity and water and detains people from the Druze community because they have liberated themselves without firing a single bullet. They have been protesting now day after day for like a year of non-stop protests while the world has not looked towards them. The Druze right now are an example of the flame that was ignited 14 years ago in Syria, and the Syrian revolution continues to live in the north and in the south thanks to the Druze community.
Thank you. And Mr. Cleaver, if I may add, to exacerbate the humanitarian crisis after the earthquake, Russia used its veto at the Security Council to shut down a crucial lifeline called a cross-border aid mechanism into northern Syria. Just for context, Assad has had no control in northern Syria for over a decade now. Assad does not control the borders with Turkey. Nonetheless, the UN insisted that they needed Assad's okay. So there was a UN mechanism called cross-border aid mechanism, a lifeline that sustained millions of people in northern Syria for 9 years. After the earthquake, Russia used its veto to terminate it, to shut it down. And instead, the UN had to negotiate a deal directly with Assad. Russia effectively handed the reins of aid distribution to Assad, so that Assad now is in charge of distributing aid to the same population he has bombed for 10 years. So that's in the north. In the south, as my colleague mentioned, people in the Druze is a minority in southern Syria, mostly in the Sweda province, but there are also Druze. There are also Druze villages in northern Syria as well, but mainly located in the south. They have been protesting day in, day out for almost a year now because they realize Assad is bankrupt. Assad cannot stabilize the country. Unfortunately, there used to be a program supported by the United States called Sycamore Timber that supported the largest moderate rebel coalition in the south. That coalition stabilized the south, protected the Druze minority, protected the borders with Jordan, kept Hezbollah and Iranian-aligned militias away. This program was disastrously terminated under the Trump administration. And now Assad is back in control. Assad uses the south to flood the region with Captagon drugs. And Hezbollah and Iranian militias also use the south to attack the Druze minority and to launch attacks against neighboring countries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Cleaver. And we now proceed with Congresswoman Victoria Sparks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I actually, never thought that, I'd be involved in some issues being a Congress member as I did, but being involved in some issues with Afghanistan, Middle East, and Israel, I spent some time and visited some countries in the region, and I feel so sorry for the people of your country, truly do. It's a very, very serious situation. I think you people been abandoned by many governments, and I think it's very brutal. Actually, saw some Syrians and actually visited some refugee camps too, and one of the countries. And I didn't, even though Syrian government condemned me, you know, Congressman Wilson and Congressman Dean Phillips crossing the border, I didn't get a chance, but someday we might, you know, but they condemn it already, so I probably need to make it happen, just make sure that the condemnation, you know, in the newspapers wasn't just for nothing, you know, but I'm used to media writing a lot of crap, so it's okay. You know, what my question is really for you, you know, what is really, and I think, you know, and you might not know, but I'm not a huge fan of UN, and they do a lot of resolutions, but I haven't seen them on the ground on any very, very bad regions and situations. So I have a challenge with us giving so much money to them, because I've seen suffering, deaths, and we still directly help countries, and I haven't seen them. So I have like two questions. One of them, maybe, you know, I haven't been directly into Syria, so you might give me, maybe they've done great things there. I would like to know. Maybe, you know, since, you know, I cannot claim on some places I've been on the ground, so I've been witness of what they're not doing, but I haven't been there, regardless of what they say, just clarify. And then the second, what else, you know, really we need to do is United States, and maybe have some international community to really get back attention to deal with I mean, there is a lot of huge loss of human lives, and war crimes are done. It's really sad what's really happening with the country. I feel very bad and feel sorry that it's really happened to a lot of people in your country.
Congresswoman, I remember exactly when that article came out. So Chairman Wilson, yourself, and Congressman Dean Phillips were visiting Turkey, and you were visiting with Syrians. I know you met with the White Helmets. I was with Congressman French Hill, Congressman Fitzpatrick, and Congressman Ben Klein, and we were actually going into Syria. I think it was one of my staff members who resembles you, and they mixed up the two. But we need to get you to Syria, and my recommendation, ma'am, is for you to visit the 55-kilometer deconfliction zone. Number one, it is safer than northwest Syria. It is under the United States military protection. I know that the commander out there, I know that the partner force out there would brief you fully, and I think you will see there the major failure of the United Nations. A camp alongside the border, in the middle of the desert, not a single teacher, not a single school, not a single, but we've established some, not a single hospital, no doctors. We just brought in 5 doctors on U.S. military aircraft that are now treating people as we speak. But you'll see how the UN has miserably failed for 9 years. I think one convoy came in that was 9 months late, came in from the Damascus office, filled with intelligence officers of the Assad regime threatening these civilians. But today, and for the last 12 months, under the Tendon program, the Syrian Emergency Task Force is able to bring in food and aid on available space on ongoing operations, taking no money or diverting no resources from Operation Inherent Resolve. But I do know, Congresswoman, it would be safe and it would be very, very important for you and other members of Congress or your staff to visit the 10th Garrison, and I'm happy to work with your staff on making that happen alongside U.S. forces.
May I add just quickly? Yes, regarding the
how we can be helpful.
Yes, regarding the UN role in Syria. So the United Nations, when the earthquake happened last year, the devastating earthquakes that struck southern Turkey and northern Syria, for the first 8 critical days after the earthquake, when lives could have been saved, the UN was nowhere to be seen on the ground. Actually, it was Syrian and Syrian American organizations that deployed on the ground to help people. But you needed heavy equipment. And you know, the UN had that, and sadly, that was not forthcoming. Because why? Because the UN was waiting for the green light from the Assad regime. That's on the first hand, on the one hand. On the other hand, generally speaking, in terms of their conduct over the past 13 years, the UN has been very accommodating of Assad. The UN does not, for example, the UN does not push back against the diversion, significant, substantial diversion of UN humanitarian assistance into Syria, so that it gets pilfered by the Assad regime. The UN does not push back. They believe their methodology or their modus operandi is, we have to work through the state, we have to work through the Assad regime. In fact, a couple of months ago, we were very disturbed to see some UN officials come to this very Congress and lobby against the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act that Chairman Wilson introduced with bipartisan support. So the UN role has been very, very problematic, to say the least, in Syria.
And sorry, just to follow up one more time. So I've had the pleasure of taking Dr. Bhavna Shamalan, M. Night Shyamalan's wife, and his daughters to northwest Syria. And I know they would wish to also come to the south. So maybe it could be a trip together. But one more thing in terms of what we can do. What we can do is we can just support the Ukrainians and the Syrians to fight their war and our war for us. And when you go, hopefully, to the 55-kilometer deconfliction zone, you will see an amazing partner force, the Syria Free Army, that has destroyed ISIS. They even gave me an ISIS coin to show that it was the last trace of ISIS in the area. And you could see the work that they're doing now, protecting our doctors, American doctors that are on the ground training people. I hope you can see it in person alongside Mrs. Shamalan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Spartz. And we've been joined by Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and that shows how important what you're doing here today. It's quite rare to have members of the Senate come all the way over here to the House side. Okay, it's even humbling, but no, it really is serious. You've got Republicans and Democrats. You've got Senate and House, and so that he can get his breath, we need to proceed with Congressman Mark Veazey all the way from Texas.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's hot right now in Texas, so we need as much breath as we can get. I wanted to ask Mr. Mustafa, you know that when you think of all the discord that the Russians have sowed, and they're continuing to sow around the world, so they can disrupt everything that has been created since the post-World War II order. I wanted to ask from your perspective, particularly since you've been on the ground, how has Russia exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Syria by their involvement there?
Where do I start? So, sir, first of all, I was in the 55-kilometer deconfliction zone. I arrived this morning, and the Russians overflew us like 10 times in one single day. The reason they're doing it is to pull information, to intimidate us, to have us scatter or go hide in bunkers, to stop the provision of humanitarian aid, to stop doctors who for the first time in 9 years showed up. Imagine 9 years. People would call me and say, I don't know why my child died. I want to know what the diagnosis is so the other one doesn't die. It is that level of desperation. And so you have the intimidation of the Russians there. The Russians, alongside the Assad regime, have a complete besiegement and starvation campaign around the 55K. They don't allow anything in. For example, when I go there, I have to bring everything that I need with me the entire time. Imagine kids that have never seen a toy or have never had cake. Imagine the worst camp in the world. I don't know a camp worse than the situation of Rukban camp. But what is amazing is if we're handing out some baby formula or if we have doctors, the discipline they have. In another place, people would be clamoring to eat something because they're starving. But I think being amazing people standing up to these evil forces has been quite inspirational. And in terms of vetoes in the Security Council for the openings of borders, which is really amazing. Like it's our money that we give the UN to give to the Syrian people. Yet we have to negotiate and give concessions so Russia allows us to bring in our aid through borders that neither Russia nor the Assad regime controls. And we clap and claim victory for getting 6 more months of an open border. Every border between the north and any border between the south should be open for the provision of aid. It shouldn't be simply in the hands of Russia and the Assad regime. And I can go on, sir, but the Russians have done everything they can to make the humanitarian situation horrible and everything they can to make sure that as many Syrian refugees go to Europe because they know that destabilizing the European Union is a major goal of theirs and they're happy to use Syrian civilians to do so.
I wanted to ask you too, if you were comparing Russia's military strategy in Syria versus what they're doing in Ukraine, what sort of lessons do you think can be learned from that? And then also, you touched on something a second ago that I think is important, that when the Russians, they just have no scruples at all when they fight these conflicts and these wars, and people need to know that what they're doing is far worse than anything that we're seeing in any theater that's happening around the world, and that we need to shed light on that because it's bad and it's terrible, and it makes everything in these regions even much worse.
Sir,
could you talk about that?
Yes, sir. The Russians are brutal. one of the things that they did to prepare for Ukraine is test over 400 different types of weapons, both internationally utilized and internationally banned weapons on Syrian civilians. They perfected the double tap attack, which is you hit a place, wait for the first responders to show up, then you hit it again. They used the same airplanes as Knight mentioned a little bit earlier. The same planes that are being used to bomb Ukrainian cities were used to bomb Syrian cities. The same pilots that trained on killing babies in Syria and continue to are killing babies with that same training in Ukraine today. So it was literally a training ground. Not only that, it was our lack of action. It was our lack of doing anything. I'm not talking about direct military intervention, but that allowed them to know that, hey, it's okay to do this in Syria. It's okay to do it in Ukraine. If we don't help Ukraine win the war completely and totally, they'll go to another place. And when they come to a NATO ally and Article 6 is invoked, then the United States is pulled into a war. All we're asking for is for the United States to stay out of war. And you only do that through the military and political support of both revolutionaries in Syria and the Ukrainian military.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm almost out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Bisi. And now we're very grateful indeed to have Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your kind words about my coming over for the Senate. It's always an honor to be in meetings of the Helsinki Commission, and thank you for the great work that this commission is doing with bipartisan support. I hope that you and all who are attending have noted that this is a very bipartisan effort, and I'm particularly honored and grateful to be with these three excellent, courageous, and strong champions of freedom and human rights. What you just said, Mr. Mustafa, I think rings particularly true. Syria has been a testing ground and a training ground, not only for the military weapons that Russia has used in Ukraine and the tactics, the inhumane and criminal tactics that it's used, but also for the human rights abuses and the humanitarian injuries that it has inflicted in Ukraine. The two fit together seamlessly in implicating Russia in crimes against humanity. Very simply, war crimes, human rights abuses of the most atrocious kind, perhaps the worst in recent history. And the United States needs to do more in Ukraine. I've advocated that there be more military, long-range artillery, air defenses, F-16s, the panoply of weapons that are necessary to disable the Russian invasion behind the lines. And as well, stronger sanctions. So my question to you today is, Russia, in effect, was forced to abandon previously controlled areas in Syria and transfer some personnel and equipment out of Syria to Ukraine. As a result, to some extent, Russia's influence in Syria has been reduced. But even with a limited presence and a strain on their resources, Russia continues to conduct bombing strikes, as you just observed, and harass not only forces there who are fighting for freedom, but also United States forces. Would additional sanctions be placed on Russia in response to this engagement in human rights abuses have possible impacts on Russia in their ability and their inclination to continue this pattern of crimes against humanity and aggression in Syria as well as in Ukraine?
Yes, I think that the more sanctions on war criminals, the better, because they are already strained by the war effort, and we need to make sure that they don't have the money to use to kill Ukrainians and Syrians. And I do want to pass it over to Mr. Shyamalan to speak more to what can we do to help Syrians and Ukrainians.
You know, I was just been listening and taking notes about, you know, what I can offer from my experience. These guys are obviously day in and day out with it, and and when I spoke earlier, I was saying I was kind of representing the uninformed American and how my journey to coming here has happened and where I started with my thinking of it all. But it just is, this is maybe helpful or not. But you know, having spoken to, let's say, the prisoners that have been taken and been in the prisons there and tortured, when I hear the specifics from them about how they're tortured, it's kind of a classic playbook of emotional torture. You have your cousin across from you, and they hurt your cousin if you don't say that you were doing something bad, and you can write it down so now they can kill you. Otherwise, I'll hurt your, and then they break something on your cousin, and then you say, then you jump to another version of that where I spoke with one of the police of Assad who escaped and was saying what they would do, and you know, I'll kill your family if you don't do this, so you have to do this, so you have to do this awful thing or I will kill your family. And I remember Caesar telling that he has 2 IDs in his pocket, and every corner he was stopped, he had to gauge which side was stopping the car and pull out whichever ID or he'd be dead if he pulled the wrong one. And his family's there, and he kept thinking about his family, and luckily Caesar's out. But and then when you think about the emotional thing that they're doing by the playbook that they're learning, which is this is a war of emotion as much as physicality, maybe more emotion. And by attacking a school and attacking a hospital, you are breaking the will, you're breaking the emotion, the ability for a human being to continue to fight. You lose hope, There's a randomness to it, a godlessness to it. And that's how they try to break the spirit. It's a playbook of emotion that they're repeating in the Ukraine, and now you see it on a kind of a country-to-country level, and the things that you were talking about in the UN. Oh, we'll play good. You know, talk to us. No. I think you're right. Let's see. Maybe we can get some aid in, and all of that emotional warfare that's going on from the prisoner level, each level up to the countries talking to themselves, and you see it repeated in Ukraine, starting all over again, and they're going to do it over and over.
That is such an important observation, and obviously you've been the face and the voice and the eyes and ears of this kind of torturous criminal conduct by Russians, and they have practiced this kind of atrocity continuously in Syria and then in Ukraine, and what you've just described is very graphic and dramatic, and I know you've done it even more so in your films, so thank you for that, sir.
Yeah, they almost count on our value system to not act. You know, they're playing our own value system against us, so they won't do anything because they're very polite. We have a value system, so they're playing that against us.
And Senator, if I may add, I would say yes, but those additional sanctions would have to be smarter sanctions. Current American sanctions against Russia are replete with loopholes, general licenses, and exemptions. So what is needed right now in terms of sanctions is secondary sanctions against Russia's oil, gas, and timber resources. That's first and foremost. In addition to that, I actually, in my testimony, called for Congress to pass the bill that you introduced with Senator Lindsey Graham to designate the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism. But overall, big picture, the fundamental issue, the fundamental flaw in American policy towards Russia is this bifurcation towards Russia's actions in Syria versus Ukraine. In Ukraine, we say Russia is not a partner and we need to stand up to Russia. In Syria, we give Putin free hand, as much latitude as his heart desires, even though Putin's actions, military actions in Syria, clearly align with his overall geopolitical goals. And even though it was in Syria where Putin first had the audacity to extend his aggression into Europe. So we need a unified strategy to challenge Putin across both theaters.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. My time has expired, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Here, here, and thank you. As we conclude, we want to get a picture with our three witnesses in just a second, but I want to thank the Senator, Mr. Shyamalan. Indeed, it's hard for people of Western civilization to conceive of the levels of barbarity. And then Mustafa, you brought up something that people need to know, and that is the double tap attack. Western minds can't comprehend what that means. It means there's an attack on a civilian target in Ukraine. A couple of months ago is where I first saw it, and to kill as many people in an apartment complex as you could. And then that's not the real attack. They wait for the EMS personnel, the emergency service, medical services. They wait for the fire service to come. They wait for the police to come. That's when the attack comes. And then, again, we just can't fathom the barbarity of this, but it's well planned. And that is, it intimidates people that aid is not coming. And then it intimidates the aid workers, the police, the EMS, and fire, that they will come, they will die if they come. This is the 21st century. All of us can do better, and I just, it's bicameral, bipartisan. We'll be working in the secondary sanctions. I can't wait to work with the senator on that, and because that is so serious. With this, if there's no further, we shall be adjourned.
Are we getting a photo?
Oh, wow.
Let's get,
Yeah. Now, I like the backdrop. I wonder if we can get them up here. Let's bring them up here, okay?
You want to bring them up here? Is it
Yeah,
gonna be
yeah,
too
yeah.
tight?
Normally, huh?
Okay.
Yeah.
Could we please ask the witnesses to come up?